The new Elden Ring patch has just gone live and it's a very good patch, especially for sorceries and incantations. And in this video I'm going to show you the differences between the old patch and the new patch. And I'm also going to go over how good or how bad the new changes actually are. So let's just get right into it. Both the legendary moon spells already had a great damage output, but now they are even much better because as you can see they have a increased cast speed and a decreased recovery time, which means that they are now much smoother to use. And now you will actually get your damage off much more often and consistently. The GAVEL of HAIMA got buffed in the previous patch and it gets a new buff in this patch as well. It also has an increased cast speed and a decreased recovery time, and now you get more hyper armor when casting it. For those that don't know, hyper armor just means that you won't collapse or get interrupted as easily when you get hit while casting. So for the GAVEL of HAIMA that also means that you will now get your damage off much more consistently. The similar type of spells, Rock Blaster and Shatter Earth, have gotten the exact same buffs as the GAVEL of HAIMA. If you remember Crystal Barrage, it got a pretty good buff last time. It pretty much went from being a completely useless spell to an actually decent spell, and this time it gets another buff because the Crystal Barrage also gets a increased cast speed and a decreased recovery time. THOP'S barrier has now an increased area effect and a slightly increased effect duration, and this is very good because previously you really had to get the timing down to actually deflect spells, but now it gives you more leeway in actually deflecting spells because you have more time and you have a bigger surface area. CARIAN GREATSWORD has now an increased cast speed at lower dexterity, which is great because it is a early game spell, and if you're going for a pure mage build then you will have a low dexterity either way, so in both aspects it's a nice little buff. The Oracle Bubbles got the exact same buffs as the legendary moon spells and Crystal Barrage, namely increased cast speed and decreased recovery time. These are actually quite decent spells if you are willing to invest some points into Arcane. Both the BRIARS of Sin and its big brother the BRIARS of Punishment spells have now a decreased recovery time and increased blood loss buildup on enemies, so they will proc bleed faster, and thus when you use these spells you will have a higher DPS now. Magma Shot now costs less FP and has an increased cast speed as well. WHIRL of Flame has now increased damage and a decreased recovery time, so that's a nice buff for that. On a similar note, Burn of Flame has now an increased cast speed and a decreased recovery time. And there's really a similar pattern for all the flame spells. Pretty much all of them have been buffed, which is I think a very nice thing that they did it as a group because it makes a Pyromancer build now much more viable than before. And the same thing actually has happened to the Black Flame school of spells as well. I'm not really sure why they buffed the Black Flame Fireball spell, because if you watch my Fate build you already know how powerful this spell is, but they did in fact increase its damage, and the spell can now also break the enemy's guard more easily as well, so it's a very significant buff for sure. And what's interesting as well is that the Scouring Black Flame spell actually got a very big buff as well because it has a increased attack range now and area effect, and on top of that it also has a decreased FP cost and a decreased recovery time, so a very major buff for that spell as well. Furthermore, all the Dragon Cult Lightning Spear spells got exactly the same buff, so I will show you the comparison for the Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear. But what basically has happened to all these similar types of spells is that they decrease the FP and stamina cost, they increase the cast speed and decrease the recovery time, and they also gave you more hyper armor while casting them. So pretty much in every area these spells have been buffed except for damage increase, so it's going to be interesting to see if without the damage increase these spells are going to be viable on their own. But all of these spells definitely did get a well-rounded buff. Now get ready for this one because Honed Bolt also got increased cast speed and decreased recovery time, but this one is very noticeable. It casts much faster now, and I do think that this spell has now become very powerful. As you can see, you just completely destroy whatever you're fighting with it. Speaking of spells that have gotten a very good buff, Black Blade is another one. It got decreased stamina consumption, but that's boring. What's really nice is the decreased recovery time. You can pretty much just chain this spell now, and it's definitely something you couldn't do before, and it makes the spell 100 times better for sure. PEST is the most underrated spell in the game, even though it's already one of the best spells in the game, but now it's basically even better because it has gotten a reduced stamina cost, which means you can just chain cast it even more. And here is our first nerf. Swarm of Flies did in fact get nerfed. It has a decreased blood loss buildup on enemy now, and thus that means that the DPS with this spell is going to be lower than before now, unfortunately. And they massacred my boy ADULA'S Moonblade as well. Well, kinda 50-50, because they decrease the power of the single cast, so those one shots that you used to see are probably a thing of the past, but they improved the performance so that the blades and the frost hit more consistently and more continuously. And they also increased the cast speed at lower dexterity, which is again useful for the early game or if you are running a pure mage build. PLACIDUSAX rune has now a decreased FP cost and a decreased stamina cost, which makes the spell more accessible to actually use. But it also has a decreased recovery time now, so you don't have to wait 6 hours every time when you finish the spell to start casting something else. And that's definitely a nice buff that this spell can very well use. Dragonclaw and DRAGONMAW got very similar buffs. They both got a decreased FP and a decreased stamina cost and a decreased recovery time. And for both spells it's now much easier to stun the enemy when you cast them and hit them with it. In addition, for DRAGONMAW, the cast speed has been increased as well. Now, if you watched my Dragon and Fate build, you know that these spells were already very powerful. So they are now even more powerful. And, well, that's a very good thing, because it makes my builds a lot more powerful as well. I think it's great that they buffed them, but I'm not really sure if this was a necessary buff. But hey, we'll take it. We'll take it. Now, GREYOLL'S Roar was already one of the best spells in the game, so another buff that's not really necessary in my opinion, but again, we'll take it. GREYOLL'S Roar now has a decreased FP, a decreased stamina cost, and a decreased recovery time, so it's even better than before. Now, the Nine-Tailed Fox spell, or Scarlet AEONIA, is actually very good now. It went from being a pretty bad spell, especially if you consider what you have to do to actually get this spell. But it's now very viable. It has an increased cast speed and a decreased recovery time. But it also gives you more hyper armor now when you actually cast it. So you have more guarantees that you're actually going to get it off and not get interrupted like before. And it's now also a very viable contender for applying Scarlet Rot on your enemies when you compare it to the Dragon Breaths like Rodent Breath and Execu's Decay, which are some of the best spells in the game. And now you can also do it with this spell. Unfortunately, you can only get this spell pretty much near the end of the game, so it's probably going to be more something for PvP or for NG+, but it's definitely nice that they finally buffed this spell. Now, the Frenzied spells got a nerf, and I think this is pretty much catered towards PvP, because you may or may not know that you could just spam Frenzied Burst or the Flame of Frenzy in PvP, apply madness continuously on your enemy and just kill them off like that without them ever being able to do anything about it. So it was probably a nerf that was necessary. Now, outside of the sorceries and incantations, a lot of bug fixes were made, so that's also nice to see. And other noteworthy things to mention are the changes to the colossal swords. Actually, they seem to be now much more viable than before, and that's actually huge news, because I know a lot of people like these type of weapons. And a lot of weapons also got a increased physical block rate and a guard boost, so that's also like a nice additional thingy. A lot of Ash of Wars also got a buff actually, but I don't think it's really interesting to see that side by side, because most of them are just a one thing type of buff. Mostly either increased cast speed or a decreased stamina cost. For everyone that's interested in the patch notes, I will put them in the description so you can read along. For sorceries and incantations, however, a lot of good stuff, as you can see. Definitely a exciting patch, and I will be making new builds cater to these changes. So definitely subscribe for that. You do not want to miss out on that, trust me. Also, smash the bell thing, because with the bell thing you will be the first to be notified if I upload something new. And give this video a like if you like the video, that will help out a lot. And let me also know your thoughts in the comments. Which changes are you the most excited about? What do you think of this patch? And yeah, just let me know your thoughts in the comments.